Some very important salary cap information came out early this week. We talk about why it's both good and bad for the Ravens, get into a mini offseason checklist, and more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Ravens podcast, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I am your host here with you, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, and we are here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here with us today, tuning in, making us your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes over in video form on YouTube, so you can see my face and my background and my shirt and everything if you want to put a face to the voice. In today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. We are back here, and it is a Tuesday edition of the show. We are going to talk a lot about the Ravens today from a salary cap perspective. The NFL put out a lot of information, and a lot of information was released about the 2023 salary cap, franchise tag numbers. It all kind of dropped, and it's both good and bad, in my opinion, for the Ravens. So I want to talk about both sides of that. We're going to talk about that throughout the first two segments here today. We'll get into the actual nitty-gritty of those numbers. I'll put on my finance hat. We'll get into it all, and we'll talk about it for the Ravens. What does it mean for Lamar Jackson? What does it mean for the organization? Some of the moves they can make for agency-wise and trade-wise. We're going to do all of that in our first two segments. Then in the final segment, I kind of wanted to put together a mini offseason checklist for the Ravens for this offseason. And I'm going to dive into more of a bigger checklist in a future episode, but just kind of getting a mini one out of the way right now to kind of put priorities in order for the Ravens as they continue to kind of get into this offseason a little bit. So let's dive into that. But before we do that, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel on YouTube if you are new here. If you're returning and you haven't hit the subscribe button yet, it is free. You can turn the notification bell on as well. Daily Ravens content here, Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. Eastern time, or right around 6 a.m. Eastern time. And it's the same show, both audio and video. So in audio form, if you're here with us, either, you're driving to work or you're listening to us just relaxing, or you're cooking or cleaning or whatever you're doing, be sure to follow us, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We had you covered, Ravens news, analysis, updates, and more. So keep it locked on here with Locked On Ravens, and I appreciate everybody for the support and for listening here today. But let's now talk about the salary cap information. So first of all, I just want to get the actual salary cap number out of the way right now. So Tom Pelissero of NFL Network reporting that the NFL informed teams on Monday that the 2023 salary cap will be a record $224.8 million. That actually coming from Tom Pelissero and Ian Rappaport. And so when comparing that to the salary cap from some of the recent years, that's up from $208.2 million in 2022, $182.5 million in 2021, and that was with the whole COVID adjustment when it went down, $198.2 million in 2020, and $188.2 million in 2019. So right around a $20 million difference, right in that $16-ish million range. That's a pretty big jump for the NFL in terms of what team's going to be able to work with this offseason, whether it's retaining guys, trying to sign free agents, maneuvering around the cap. And for Baltimore, the fact that it went up by 6, people were expecting a jump, but I think this, and I don't know the overall assumption as to what the cap number was going to be this year, but I think this is maybe a little more than some people anticipated. And this stuff usually happens. The salary cap usually goes up, TV deals and revenue and all that goes on. So for the Ravens, this is good news. The fact that they'll have a little more wiggle room to work with, especially as they try to improve their team, figure out the Lamar Jackson situation. I think the Ravens are still top 10 in cap space. Now, when looking at what the Ravens actually have available in cap space right now, it puts them with that increased number, it puts the Ravens right around $27.8 million in cap space. And I know that a lot of people, early on it was the Ravens, the projections were 47 million. I think one projection was like 54 million. And so a lot of people are wondering 27.8, that's a lot less than a lot of people were expecting. So what happened to that? And Ravens salary cap, Brian McFarland does a great job kind of breaking this all down from a Ravens perspective. And people are asking, what happened to the Ravens money? And Brian talked about the Roquan Smith deal. There were escalators for Devin Duvernay and Justin Madubuike. There were incentives for Calais Campbell, Marlon Humphrey, and Mark Andrews. And also they've signed 9 former practice squad players. So that 47 million number, 54 million number, I think was the projection when the Ravens only had, I think it was 41 players under contract. So that was an early projection. Now with that Roquan Smith deal and all those other escalators and incentives and things like that, it's going to come in right around, I think it's right at $27.8 million right now. So that's, it's a decently sized number to work with, but obviously that number does not include Lamar Jackson. And that's a whole other situation in terms of, I think Lamar is going to be making more than $27.8 million per season. And that's not even taking into account all the other moves the Ravens should make this offseason, the incoming draft class. So the Ravens will have to maneuver around the salary cap. But the thing, and we'll kind of get into this in the second segment, the thing with the Lamar contract is I would anticipate if the Ravens and Lamar are able to get a long-term deal done, I try to imagine, and I think that the Ravens will probably make that contract backloaded. Well, they'll probably try to lower the cap hit in the early season so they have the wiggle room to work around the Roquan deal and, the end of the Humphrey deal and the Stanley deal and the Andrews deal, and then kind of figure out. And then once that deal kind of goes up a little bit, you kind of get 2-3 years in, then that salary cap hit number probably goes up a little bit. We'll talk about that. The other stuff that was put out there, the salary cap, not just that, but the franchise tag numbers. Albert Breer put out the numbers for each position franchise tag wise. The 2023 franchise tag numbers as of today, Monday, for every position. Well, the one that's important is quarterbacks. I'm just going to read that. $32.4 million for quarterbacks. That is the non-exclusive tag. So for Lamar Jackson, if you were to get non-exclusive tag by the Ravens, that would be $32.4 million. Now, the exclusive tag, and what that is that averages the top 5 quarterback cap numbers. And that right now is around $45 million-ish. So that would be the exclusive tag. And you might be asking, you might be wondering, what's the difference between this non-exclusive franchise tag and the exclusive franchise tag? Well, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to try to read through it with you and understand it in the moment. So how it works is, obviously, the difference is it's salary cap and also the negotiating power. So each of these tags comes with, different rights and assets and things that the teams can get. So the exclusive tag gives the team exclusive negotiating rights. So if the Ravens were to apply that tag to Lamar, only the Ravens would have exclusive rights to negotiate with him. And should the player reject that offer, they're unable to sign with another NFL team for that entire season. And then you look at the non-exclusive tag, that allows the player to negotiate with other teams. And if that player receives an offer, the current team has an opportunity to match that offer from a different team. And if the team does not match that offer, they are entitled to receive 2 first-round picks in exchange. This coming from Charlotte Edmonds here from NBC Sports. So very, very grateful for this article that kind of breaks it down a little bit. Then you get into things like the transition tag, where the transition tag is instead of top 5 highest paid players, it's top 10 highest paid players at a position. I don't have the number for that right now. But so the Ravens have to make that decision with the salary cap numbers coming out and the franchise tag numbers coming out as they are, with the non-exclusive tag being that 32, right in that $32-ish million range. If they want to give the opportunity for Lamar to go out there and negotiate and see if, do they want to match it? Do they not want to match that? I'm sure if Lamar hits the open market and negotiates with other teams, the team's going to give him a mega deal. Not that the Ravens shouldn't do that, but, then we'll see, what's the Ravens kind of cap? What are they saying we'll go up to and then we'll stop at? So that's what I'll be interested to see what they do there. But if it is the exclusive tag, you're paying $45 million for Lamar. That, and all these numbers, the $32 million for non-exclusive and the $45 for exclusive, the franchise tag numbers stay 1 year fully guaranteed deal on that tag if they do sign. And players don't have to sign the tag. We see players get tagged and then they hold out or they don't show up. So that's a whole nother conversation. But so the Ravens, with that $27.8 million in cap space, with the salary cap numbers coming out right now, that $32 million would put them right about $5 million over. The $45 million will put him even more over. So they could restructure. I think we're going to see a couple of restructures most likely throughout the course of this offseason. Maybe the Ravens have a couple of salary cap casualties. We'll talk again more about what is good about these numbers, what is bad about these numbers in our second segment. So don't go anywhere. Still a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is brought to you by Blue Nile, and Valentine's Day is coming up, and I don't have to tell you how important Valentine's Day is. It means romance is in the air more than usual, and I don't need to tell you that either. You've probably had your date plans on the calendar for weeks now, but if you found the perfect Valentine's Day gift yet, whether you're celebrating this day of romance, whether you're ready to pop the question, you can find Julie as unique as she is with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. And Blue Nile has so many great things at BlueNile.com. You can find the perfect piece of jewelry for life's special moments, or even create the custom engagement ring of her dreams. Their simple online tools let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then handcraft that perfect piece to your specific specifications. Blue Nile provides expert guidance, in-depth educational materials, and unique online tools that place you in control. So you can forget about the usual hassles of jewelry shopping and that process, which can be very much a process, and focus on the romance. Blue Nile's diamond price guarantee allows you to compare a competitor's diamond against one of theirs. Blue Nile can even meet or beat their price. Every order is insured and arrives quickly in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shipping is free, and so are the returns. So right now you can save up to 50% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com for the 50% off. BlueNile.com. We return here to our second segment of this Tuesday edition of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you. Thank you so much again for tuning in with us today and making us your first listen. Be sure to, again, like this video, subscribe on YouTube, follow along in audio form, and make your second listen Locked On NFL. If you missed it, I host a Monday show over there every week, so you can hear me talk with our experts from around our network about the biggest stories. So we talk Eagles, we talk Chiefs, we even talk the Panthers and that Frank Reich hire, so be sure to check that out over there. But let's talk Ravens here. Let's continue our conversation about the salary cap numbers. Again, the Ravens projected to have right around $27.8 million in salary cap space. The NFL obviously informing teams Monday that the cap will be a record $224.8 million. So I think it's a good thing for the Ravens that this bump was so significant, and that I think the cap is obviously, the NFL is such a big league. It dominates the other sports leagues in terms of revenue and viewership. We've seen that. But I think it's a good thing as the cap continues to rise. The Ravens continue to have wiggle room to work with. And one of the good things in all of this is Eric DeCosta and the Ravens front office has shown the ability to be able to maneuver the cap a little bit. And you can't keep everybody. I know all the sayings, the cap is a myth, it's not real, but you cannot keep, we've seen that with the Ravens. Was it Darius Smith and Matthew Judon? And we might see it, especially with an extension from Lamar. If that happens, the Ravens will probably have to sacrifice some talent at other positions. But the bad of this whole thing is the fact that the Ravens will have to do that maneuvering. Not that the Ravens don't have to be able to do it, but they will have to have some decisions here and there that, might be just chopping talent, because if there's a Lamar extension, or if this franchise tag number, $32 million for non-exclusive, around $45 for exclusive, that dents almost actually the entire salary cap space that the Ravens are projected to have. So again, this comes down to how the Ravens want to approach this offseason, and we'll kind of dive into this in the third segment for a mini checklist, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But there are so many questions with it, because if the Ravens move off of Lamar Jackson, right, if they decide to trade him and they get first round picks and they take a rookie quarterback, and that's what it is, they have a quarterback on a rookie contract, the Ravens have room. They're not necessarily quote unquote strapped for cash. And I don't think they, it depends what they do restructure wise, salary cap cuts wise. I think they can still make a couple of moves from outside the organization to improve their roster. Obviously, wide receivers, the position a lot of people are looking at, myself included. Cornerbacks, another one. But for DeAndre Hopkins, can you take on that $19 million base salary with Lamar Jackson on a $30 million franchise tag, or on a $45+ million contract? That comes down to the cap hits of that contract. So if the first year cap hit for Lamar is $7 million or $10 million or something like that, then you can work around that, and you can line up contracts so that when one big contract is kind of hitting its peak of extremely high salary cap hit numbers, you can have another one that, you're still signing a guy to a big contract, but then that contract starts out with very low hits. So as one contract goes up, the other one starts low. And then as that contract goes up, another one starts low. It's kind of like the rising and falling action. So the Ravens, I think, will be able to maneuver around that. But when looking at two things here, when first looking at their actual free agent list, and I'm going to take out Lamar Jackson from this conversation. He's obviously the most important part of this, but just removing him from this right now, Baltimore doesn't necessarily have a ton of guys that they need to re-sign to big money contracts, if any, right now. I mean, I think, honestly, depending on what happens with Marcus Peters and what his market is, I think the Raven that will probably get the biggest contract in free agency is probably going to be Ben Powers. And I don't project Ben Powers coming back to Baltimore. I think that the Ravens will probably let him walk. And again, nothing's set in stone right now. It'd be great to get him back. He played really well in 2022. But if the Ravens don't re-sign Ben Powers, well, I think we'll get a decently sizable deal, not necessarily break the bank money, but I think a team will pay him. If the Ravens don't bring him back, it does come down to, what is Peters getting on the open market? If a team really values him and wants to pay him, 2 years, $20 million, 3 years, $30 million, I'm probably not going that high if I'm the Ravens. But if you can get him back on like a 2-year, $10 million deal, 2-year, $12 million deal, I don't think that's terrible. I mean, I think he came off an injury. He struggled. It wasn't realistic for every single Raven who was coming off an injury to play well. Now, I don't think, again, the Ravens should give him 10 plus million per season, but if you can get him on 5 or 6 million annually, I think you could maybe do that. Justin Houston's another guy who you look at. Is he somebody who maybe will garner another 1-year deal for the Ravens? 1 year 4, 1 year 5 million. I'd do that. I'd bring Justin Houston back on that. But then it's Kyle Fuller. Maybe you bring him back. Juwan James. Maybe. Sammy Watkins, I don't think so. Jason Pierre-Paul, I don't think so. Brent Urban, maybe. Steven Means, maybe. Josh Oliver would be great to bring back, but it depends what his market is. I think the Ravens could probably afford to bring him back if they wanted to. Kenyon Drake, DeMarcus Robinson maybe is like a wide receiver 5, but then it's like Vince Beagle and Kevon Seymour and Tristan Colon Castillo and Kristen Welch and Geno Stone. Geno Stone, I think, he'll be a restricted free agent. I think that you bring him back. Tyler Huntley, I think you bring him back. Hopefully you do. Nick Moore, I think you bring back. Justice Hill, I think you bring back. And then it's Delshon Phillips. So my point is that the Ravens don't necessarily, after Lamar Jackson and potentially, whatever happens with him, the two big contract guys potentially are Ben Powers and Marcus Peters. And so your big decision in free agency for the Ravens is Lamar Jackson. If you can figure out that cap situation, if you're going $32 million fully guaranteed or $45 million fully guaranteed, it's a little bit tough because you can't spread that money out because it's 1 year at that price. But if you sign him to a 5-year deal, you can spread the money out how you want to, even if it is guaranteed. And you can figure out how much you want to have in that first year, how much you want to have in the third year, the fourth year, etc. So that's really important. But then in terms of restructures, I think that it's also important to note that the Ravens have done this in the past, obviously, and two interesting ones that I'm interested to see what they do with Kevin Zeitler and Calais Campbell. Now, Zeitler is scheduled to have a $9.4 million cap hit. If he was released by the Ravens, it would be 2.975 in dead cap, which means right around $7 million in savings. I'm keeping Kevin Zeitler. I mean, maybe you restructure that if you can, maybe convert stuff into bonuses. I don't know the specifics of it, but I think Kevin Zeitler is worth more than $7 million in cap space, but sometimes these are the tough decisions you have to make. So I'm on team keep Kevin Zeitler. Do not get that twisted, but it's interesting to note kind of where the Ravens can save money with cuts. Another one would be Calais Campbell, $9.4 million cap hit with a $2.4 million dead cap hit. So that, again, $7 million in savings. I think you could keep Calais Campbell for the Ravens, but these are the kinds of guys where you can actually save like, for example, Tavon Young last year. Not a lot of people wanted to cut Tavon Young. I know some people did, but he was really the only guy they could cut to save salary cap. So maybe the Ravens cut Campbell and bring him back on like a 1 year, $4 million deal. Maybe they cut Zeitler and bring him back on a 1 year, $6 million deal. Now Zeitler, those two guys at those prices are both absolute bargains. But again, Roquan Smith, right? He signed a 5-year, $100 million contract. His first year cap hit, according to Spotrac here, is $9 million. So you can spread that out with Lamar's hit. if you kind of take the same approach where you can kind of backload that deal. Marcus Williams, again, he signed that 5-year, $70 million cap hit. His 2023 cap hit is $7.8 million. So it's kind of in that same ilk. Chuck Clark is another one, $6 million, $2 million in dead cap, well, 6.2 and 2.2. So that's $4 million in cap savings. I anticipate more of a trade there. But can you restructure maybe a Ronnie Stanley or a Marlon Humphrey or Mark Andrews? I don't have enough information on that to give specifics right now, but those are the guys that I'm kind of looking at in terms of could you restructure those top three options and kind of figure it out that way. But then you have to talk about extensions, for other guys. There's a lot to talk about with the salary cap, but I think it is a good thing the cap went up. I mean, obviously, it's a good thing the cap went up. It's not so great. The Ravens have, I guess, reduced cap space from what was originally projected, but that's what happens when you sign a guy to a 5-year, $100 million contract. You have those incentives and escalators. So I think it's both good and bad, but it's good in general just to get the information. This does not mean the Ravens are doomed. That this information does not mean Baltimore is doomed. You have guys in that front office who are smart, who can manipulate the cap a little bit, and who can free up space in multiple different ways. So we will see what the Ravens do throughout this offseason to maximize that cap. But for now, that's the information we were given. And I just wanted to talk a bit about it from a Ravens perspective and obviously from a Lamar Jackson perspective. I think it's good for Lamar too. Big cap numbers, big guaranteed money. If a tag is what ends up being signed by him, 32 million, 45 million. And then with the cap going up, it gives all teams wiggle room. So the money should be flowing for Lamar, but I think we all already knew that. But coming up in our final segment, we'll talk about a mini offseason checklist for the Ravens and going through that. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And this year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel lets you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. And for me, I'm a big basketball guy too. I'm a Denver Nuggets fan. If you do not know that already, Denver plays the Pelicans tonight. They're favored by 8. I know the Pelicans don't have Zion. The Nuggets went through a tough loss to Philadelphia on Saturday. Very heartbreaking, but hopefully they bounce back here on Tuesday. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. And the FanDuel app, it really is super easy to use. It makes a very user-friendly experience, which I really like. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We've returned here. It's our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher is still here with you, rounding out our Tuesday episode. And thank you so much again for being here with us, making us your first listen. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, follow along in audio form, make your second listen Locked On NFL. And Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get inside analysis from the hosts that covered the NFL's next generation in college and find out which NFL draft boards these players will be climbing all in one location. Go subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. It is draft season. We're coming up on mock draft Mondays in a couple weeks here. That's super. I really love doing those. I love the interaction. So stay tuned for updates on that. But with that being said, the Ravens do have a very important offseason ahead. We talked about the salary cap, but what are they going to do this offseason? What should they do this offseason? We'll talk a bit about a checklist, a mini one here. And again, we'll dive into a bigger checklist on a future episode coming up in the coming weeks before the free agency bonanza starts. But I think for me, if I had to put together just a pretty miniature checklist for what the Ravens need, what I want them to do this offseason personally, number one is just figure out what's going on with Lamar. I think that so many people are so ready for the situation to just be lifted off their shoulders. I'm sure the organization and Lamar are the two biggest ones who are just saying, let's just figure it out. But it works out in a lot of different ways where, you have to figure out the guarantees. You have to figure out the years. And so I think for Baltimore, you have to figure out if Lamar is going to be your quarterback. And ideally, that time is before free agency. Tag him, trade him, sign him, whatever it is. I am still on the sign Lamar Jackson train. But we don't know what's going to happen here. And I think a lot of a lot of what the Ravens are going to have to do in this offseason depends on what is the situation with Lamar and what is that solution and who's the next offensive coordinator. So I guess number 2 is find an offensive coordinator, but how I think it's going to work is I think the Ravens will find their offensive coordinator before the Lamar situation gets solved. But I think a lot of, personnel decisions come with whatever new ideas this offensive coordinator that comes in is going to have. So whether that is a Zach Robinson, Eric Bieniemy, we talked about other names, Dave Canales, and, we talked about other ones who have now gotten other opportunities like Frank Reich. We've talked about a bunch of different ideas here for the Ravens. Todd Monken, another one who, college rank guy. Whoever the Ravens bring in, I think will dictate a little bit of what this offense looks like. In fact, will dictate a lot of what this offense looks like. So who do you bring in wide receiver wise? How much of a need is there for a fullback, for example, right? A lot of this is going to hinge on Lamar and whoever the next offensive coordinator is. Now, actually, positionally, I've talked about wide receiver. I think that to me is a massive, probably my number 1 need of the offseason for the Ravens. My number 2 need for the Ravens is probably cornerback. I say other checklist priorities for them would be probably figuring out some defensive line depth if Calais Campbell doesn't come back. The left guard position, if Ben Powers doesn't come back, that's another pretty big one that I think they should look at. Also, outside linebacker, you have Tyus Bowser and David Ajabo and Rafe Owe, but what happens to Justin Houston? Do you bring him back? Chuck Clark, another guy who I think has a very interesting offseason ahead in terms of what happens with his status. Is he traded? Is he on a different team next year? Does he return to Baltimore? That's one I'm personally monitoring. And then just how do the Ravens move forward with what they want to do as an organization? Obviously, the expectations for this Ravens team for many years now, especially during the Lamar Jackson era, have been, these dominant teams, especially after what happened in 2019 with just how good they were that season, and they've fallen short. So a lot of people argue that the Ravens wasted Lamar's rookie contract by not really maximizing it, or we see all these quarterbacks on rookie contracts, getting to the Super Bowl. Obviously, Jalen Hurts on his rookie deals in the Super Bowl right now. Patrick Mahomes, who is in there right now, obviously not on his rookie contract, but he won a Super Bowl on his rookie contract. Joe Burrow got to the Super Bowl last year on his rookie deal. So again, it's kind of like that trend where, you want to maximize your roster. And now the Ravens have to go into a situation where Lamar's going to be getting, if they keep Lamar, he's going to be getting paid a boatload of money. I think well-deserved, right? I do think well-deserved, but that does hinder your ability to go out there and maybe bring back a Patrick Queen a couple years down the line, bring back a J.K. Dobbins a couple years down the line. It's decisions like that that will define the Ravens, and it might hit into their depth a little. So I think hitting on draft picks is super important. You get to the draft part of things. I think to me, the Ravens, I'd like to see them maybe get one more pick, maybe 6 or 7 picks in this draft, depending. Obviously, the Ravens picked 11 rookies last year. That was a lot. So they had 6 fourth-rounders. It was a lot of rookies. So to me, maybe not that many picks, but right in that 5, 6, 7 sweet spot. Maybe 5 is a little low. That's how many they have right now. But for the Ravens, they have multiple big decisions to make throughout this offseason. And other depth pieces too, such as a Geno Stone and a Justice Hill and a Josh Oliver. Do you bring those guys back? Can you afford to bring those guys back? The Ravens like to they like to sign guys to the 3-year, $16 million, 4-year, $25 million deals. Lamar Jackson, if he gets a big deal, will cut into the ability for them to do that. So we'll see, but I do think a lot of this offseason hinges on what happens with Lamar and the next offensive coordinator. You get those 2 situations figured out, then you can figure out where your true needs are. But if the Ravens do bring back Lamar, I do think your only 2 true, you need to figure out that room for the Ravens is wide receiver and cornerback, with then just little depth questions and bringing back guys questions sprinkled in throughout the rest of the roster there. So an interesting offseason ahead. We'll be covering it here on Locked On Ravens. That's all I have for you here today, though, on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for being here with us today. When we get back here tomorrow, it is more Ravens talk from us, so be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you right back here tomorrow.